So Conor McGregor's rape trial has come to a conclusion, and it's bad news for him. Let me say up front, what we're going to do on this channel is I'm going to recap what we know from what happened today and what it might mean for his fighting career. But obviously, there is a lot more to the story, including about details relevant to the trial itself, evidentiary pieces from obviously the prosecution or the side of Nikita Hand, that's the woman in question, as well as what Conor may have replied with and why we ended up with the verdict that we ended up with. I'm going to try, and I've been actually actively trying to find someone all day to help me understand some of the more nuances of the trial itself, what it all means, the way it's being viewed in Ireland. There's a lot of different pieces that I won't necessarily get to today that we will have some more exploration for in the future. But there is a lot that we know today, so let's talk about it. Okay, so here are the brass tacks. Conor McGregor was found civilly liable for sexual assault of Nikita Hand. That is the woman in question who had sued him. This is the woman in question of the night of December in 2019. This is 2 months following his loss, Conor McGregor's loss to Khabib Nurmagomedov. This incident took place in the Beacon Hotel in Dublin, Ireland. A jury of, according to BBC, 8 women and 4 men ultimately agreed with Nikita Hand that she deserved judgment here and was awarded a penalty, in this particular case, about $240,000, give or take. I'll put the figure up here on the screen. And it's awarded along different lines of what the damages are in accordance with the particular case. Again, we'll get to some of these details later, but what you should know is the penalty here, aside from any kind of social or reputational harm, is approximately, give or take, about $240,000 US dollars. Now, this, as I mentioned, was a civil trial, not a criminal trial. That's why you have to say he's civilly liable and not a convicted rapist, because to be a convicted rapist, a conviction itself comes from the criminal side. Again, why this was not a criminal matter, we will talk about with someone else in the future, but it wasn't. However, it was allowed to go forward as a civil case, and Nikita Hand ultimately emerged victorious today in this long-standing battle that traces back basically 6 years, almost to the month, from the incident, as I mentioned, in the Dublin hotel room in December of 2019. I have seen some reports that Conor might not be able to travel and some other stuff like that. That is not my understanding as of present moment. In fact, I'm pretty sure it is not. You would have to be criminally liable for there to be beyond any considerations about jail or whatever the case may be. None of those are in play. So Conor, I guess, free to travel, and I guess only is going to have to pay this amount of money. There is, however, obviously some social and reputational harm that will come with this. My understanding is his standing in Ireland was already pretty close to rock bottom, and this is going to put it over the edge. But that's a conversation for a different time. You might be asking, what are some of the differences between a civil and a criminal case? Now, the Irish justice system has some unique eccentricities different from the American one, but there is one sort of more or less commonality. In a criminal case, there has to be the prosecution has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that someone committed the crime in place. That's the evidentiary burden, and it's considered a pretty high burden, especially relative to a civil case. In a civil case, it basically just has to be a preponderance of the evidence. Is it more likely than not what is alleged took place? That's essentially what the burden of proof is. It's a little bit lower. As I mentioned on MK today, you saw something similar with O.J. Simpson here in the United States. He was ultimately acquitted. Now, he did have a criminal component. Conor did not have that. But the point I'm trying to make is, once the criminal case that he had concluded, they went right to the civil case, and he was found liable there. Again, it's a different level of evidentiary proof, a different jury in that particular case. It wouldn't be the same one for the criminal and the civil. So that's where we ended up today in terms of the basic nuts and bolts. She sued him for basically sexual assault related to that one night in the Dublin hotel room, as I mentioned, in December of 2019, 2 months following his loss to Khabib Nurmagomedov, and the jury agreed ultimately with her version of events and what happened. Conor, for his part, put out a statement after the deliberations were concluded and the judge and the jury awarded for Nikita Hand. He says the following, quote, "I will be appealing today's decision, the judge's instruction, and the modest award given was for assault, not for aggravated or exemplary damages. I am disappointed that the jury did not hear all the evidence that the DDP reviewed. I am with my family now, focused on my future. Thank you to all my support worldwide." Nikita Hand also spoke to the press after the conclusion of the trial. I'm not going to play the whole bit of it, but here's some.
I'm overwhelmed and touched by the support I have received from everybody. First, I want to thank the Coleman legal team and my 3 barristers, John, Gordon, Ray Boland and Sean. They have been amazing from start to finish. I want to thank Mr. Justice Alexander Owens, the jury, all the witnesses. I want to thank the doctors, nurses and everyone at the sexual assault treatment unit in the Rotunda Hospital for looking after me, especially my own Dr. Frank Clark. I want to thank the Rape Crisis Centre, especially Cleena, who has been by my side throughout this entire period. I want to thank all the guards and the ambulance crew. I want to thank all the women and men out there who have supported me throughout this trial. For every person who reached out to me, a card, a letter, email, everything, it hasn't gone unnoticed. Thank you, I really appreciate it so much. I want to thank my partner Gary, who has been so supportive for the last 4 years and has held my hand throughout this trial every day and every other day. I want to thank my mum and all my family and friends. Lastly, I want to thank my daughter Freya, who I'm most grateful for. She has given me so much strength and courage over the last 6 years throughout this nightmare to keep on pushing forward for justice. I want to show Freya and every other girl and boy that you can stand up for yourself if something happens to you, no matter who the person is, and justice will be served. To all the victims of sexual assault, I hope my story is a reminder that no matter how afraid you might be, speak up, you have a voice, and keep on fighting for justice. I know this has impacted not only my life, my daughter's, my family and friends tremendously, and it's something that I'll never forget for the rest of my life. But now that justice has been served, I can now try and move on and look forward to the future with my family and friends and daughter.
Now again, we haven't gotten to hardly any of the details because we really have to treat this, I think, with the significance that it deserves. I personally find Nikita Hand's account to be very convincing. It seems to me unlikely that someone would go through 6 years of this kind of thing. And of course, given some of the facts in the case about, again, I know this might be difficult to hear for some, but in terms of what doctors had to do to essentially medically repair her by the time she showed up and all of the bruising and everything else that goes into it, these are harrowing details. Then to pursue that, by the way, I'm sure we'll look into this about to what extent she was ever offered a settlement. That never happened. And ultimately, in the end, she gets a pretty modest award, given what I think some folks might imagine. There was some bad faith accusation that this was some kind of cheap money grab. It does not appear that way to me. That's my personal opinion. That someone would go through 6 years of this kind of thing, trying to do their best to get ahead, all while, by the way, they had to move her and her significant other after men with balaclavas entered their abode, their house of residence, and her significant other was stabbed. Again, to what extent that is related to these events, you can judge for yourself. But then another woman who also had some kind of claims alleging Conor McGregor's conduct had her car firebombed. Again, this is my personal opinion, but it seems to me that her accounting of the evidence, her demeanor, her pursuit of what appears to be quite obviously a need for justice, it is very compelling to me, and I suspect it will be very compelling to other people as well. And this gets us to a point about what do we say about his fighting career. Independent of today's events, I feel like this is, again, my personal opinion, his fighting career. Not so much his wealth or whether he'll hold on to it or what he might do with BKFC. None of that's really in question, but as a fighter, it was on life support for me to begin with. They've had a hard time getting him back into the octagon. They got pretty close at UFC 303, and then an injury that he probably would have mocked an opponent for having is what kept him out, and they were supposed to have him back at the end of the year. That didn't work. Then they were supposed to have him back early in next year, and that didn't work. And now Dana White previously saying before today that it won't be until later in the year. People have speculated, is that part of what could happen from this trial? Is it part of just some kind of attempt to negotiate television rights with a new broadcast partner? All of that is certainly in speculation. But even before what the verdict was today, it just seemed like if you get him back at all, that's a minor miracle, and he could win depending on how they matchmake. But the Conor McGregor magic as a fighter, to me, is over. It's over. It has been over for quite some time. And today's event, while not necessarily, it's hard to declare exactly what impact it will have, but one wonders what the UFC's perspective on this is going to be for one of their fighters to, again, to be held civilly liable for rape in a very high-profile case. The UFC is typically not very great about doing anything about fighter misconduct outside of the workplace, but one never knows. Although if anyone's going to get an exemption in any kind of situation like this, arguably their most popular fighter would be the very kind of guy, but we shall see. Nevertheless, though, this was, as I understand it, he is deeply unpopular, at least polarizing, I think is perhaps a modest way to put it, inside Ireland. An event like this might put his reputation into tatters in his home country. It is hard to say exactly what role it will have here in the United States in terms of the impressions that he makes. It's not like the combat sports media is really going to press him on any of these details, and it's not exactly like the UFC's got a great history of like cutting their ties to people who engage in otherwise, let's call it, questionable behavior outside of the octagon, especially when they have a level of popularity. But I don't know. It just feels like, again, from a personal perspective, it just kind of feels like there's been this mounting kind of both distance from the fight game as well as maybe a certain kind of reckoning that he has had coming, not merely just with this case, but with all the other incidents of assault or questionable behavior that he's engaged in. And these are not limited. Yeah, you have on the small end the guy with the cell phone in Miami, but then you have also the case of the woman jumping off the yacht. You have another woman whose car was firebombed. You got him punching the Italian DJ, allegedly. I mean, you had a series of incidents where he has been alleged to and now held civilly liable for violent behavior. At some point, there's going to be an accumulated weight to that. Whether this is the thing that gets fans to turn against him, whether this is the thing that UFC ultimately uses as a way to cut ties with him, that seems unlikely. But there nevertheless is, it's a little too early to call today an inflection point, but it would be very foolish to not call this a consequential day, both in his life professionally, in his life personally, and in his status as a celebrated figure in the fight world. We shall see how things go going forward, but today feels, I think I'm saying it fairly, today feels monumental. Even more fuel to the fire. People are resurfacing. It's not a new tweet, it's an old one from years ago, circa the same time, where Khabib Nurmagomedov, his most famous opponent, said the following, quote, "Rapist, you are a rapist. You are a hypocrite who is not responsible for your actions. Justice will find you. We will see," at the Notorious MMA, which of course is Conor McGregor's Twitter handle. Bad day. Bad day for Conor McGregor. A good day for justice, depending on your perspective, and I think it is. I think Nikita Hand has been a incredibly brave woman, an incredibly determined advocate for justice, and has had to deal with a level of nightmarish violation of her personhood, of more than half a decade of her life, in the cause that ultimately culminated today. We will see ultimately what happens. I'm going to talk to a subject matter expert about this for further clarification, and I don't know what the story is going to be with any kind of appeal that Conor McGregor goes through and how long that might take. We'll have to see. But as I mentioned today, Conor McGregor losing in trial, held civilly liable for sexual assault of Nikita Hand. More details to come.